You might think that if there's anything we can all agree is terrifying, it's the prospect of nuclear war. If there's anything we can all agree needs to be avoided at all costs, it's the prospect of nuclear war. But in a study revealed earlier this year, apparently not everyone is as scared of that as you might have predicted. Take a look. The prospect of a war with North Korea, especially any kind of nuclear war with North Korea, should be one of the most terrifying things imaginable for the American people. But a new survey shows that it's really not, and that itself should be terrifying for us. I'm talking about a new study by the Bulletin of the atomic scientists who work with YouGov to ask Americans about a variety of different potential strikes against North Korea. And here is what they found. Among the most disturbing results discovered was that a large hawkish minority lurks within the US public. Over a third of respondents approve of a US preventive strike, as they call it, across all scenarios described, and appear insensitive to informational cues that most security experts would expect to reduce such levels of support. So what does that mean? What that means is they ask people if they would support some kind of war with North Korea, and then they find out that a certain percentage say yes. So then they make the cost of that war more onerous to try to lower support, to see if this is effective in lowering support for these sorts of wars. They find that in this case, there's a lot of Americans that don't really care what ends up happening. So let's talk about some specifics. Across all conditions, approval for a US preemptive strike on North Korea is notably, although not always significantly in a statistical sense, higher than preference, which means that while they might not prefer to do this sort of thing, if Trump were to strike North Korea, a significant percentage, maybe a majority of the US population would support it. So including, by the way, 33% preferring a nuclear strike against North Korea rather than some sort of conventional one. We're talking about a significant chunk of the American people saying if Donald Trump drops nuclear bombs on North Korea, I mean, 1/3 are like, yeah, that's exactly what I want, and more are like, well, I'm not gonna go against the president on this. Like, let that sink in. Preemptive nuclear war, like half the country might be okay under certain situations. And by the way, in terms of how damaging that would be, the negative results, which should be obvious when it comes to a nuclear strike, it didn't really change when they're prompting people. They say 15,000 civilians might die or more than 1 million civilians might die. That had virtually no impact on the American people's willingness to engage in a preemptive nuclear strike. Think about that. We're not just now talking about some neocons in government. We're not talking about defense contractors or even a number of politicians in both parties who seem all too willing to engage in reckless war that has the obvious consequence of killing civilians. We have the American people being told over 1 million civilians would die, and generally a lot of them seem okay with that. And interestingly, they found that when you ask people also if they support the death penalty, you'll be shocked to find out that the people who support the death penalty are much more likely to approve of some sort of nuclear strike, even if it kills millions of civilians. When they talk to individuals in this study and ask them why they support this sort of action, many of them said things like, that's the fastest way to end North Korea, or in some cases, to end North Koreans. And so the propaganda that has made people think that North Korea is just the dictatorship, that's all it is. These people are all the same. They're not regular people like you and I. They don't need to be protected under our foreign policy. That has sunk in for a significant chunk of the American population. It's not 5%, it's not 10, it's not 20%. You are surrounded by people that if we were to start dropping nuclear bombs, many of them would be perfectly fine with that. That should be horrifying, that should be front page news. But outside of this video and an awesome write-up in Newsweek about it, I don't know how many people are actually gonna talk about this, and that's pretty scary by itself. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.